On the evening of November 25th, 1135, King Henry I of England returned from a long day of hunting in a forest in Normandy. The 67-year-old monarch, known throughout his realm as a vigorous ruler, appeared to be in excellent health. Within a week, however, one of medieval England's most capable kings would be dead, and his kingdom would be plunged into nearly 2 decades of devastating conflict. The circumstances surrounding his death have fascinated historians for centuries, spawning theories ranging from simple gluttony to deliberate poisoning. Henry had ruled England for 35 years, transforming it from a conquered territory still adjusting to Norman rule into one of the leading states in Europe. He'd survived rebellions, family betrayals, and the tragedy of watching his only legitimate son drown in the English Channel. Yet on that cold November night, something would strike him down with terrifying speed, setting in motion a chain of events that would reshape English history. According to the chronicler Henry of Huntingdon, writing in his Historia Anglorum, the king fell ill after consuming a large meal of lampreys against the advice of his physicians. Lampreys, primitive, eel-like fish that attach themselves to other creatures with sucker-like mouths, were considered a delicacy among medieval nobility. Henry was known to be particularly fond of them, and the tradition of presenting lamprey pie to English monarchs would continue for centuries. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis provides a slightly different account, suggesting that the king had already begun to feel unwell during the hunt itself before returning to his hunting lodge. This discrepancy raises questions about whether the lamprey meal was truly the cause of his illness, or merely a convenient explanation attached to an already developing condition. Medieval chroniclers were fond of dramatic narratives, and a king dying from excessive indulgence carried moral weight that would resonate with audiences. The sin of gluttony was one of the 7 deadly sins, and attributing a monarch's death to such excess served as a cautionary tale. Whatever the initial cause, Henry's condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days. He experienced fever, convulsions, and general malaise, symptoms that proved resistant to the medical interventions available at the time. As his situation became clearly terminal, the king summoned Archbishop Hugh of Amiens to hear his confession. Robert of Gloucester, his favorite illegitimate son, gathered at his bedside alongside other members of the court. Henry died on December 1st, 1135, having reigned for more than 3 decades. The account provided by Archbishop Hugh describes what contemporaries would have considered a good death. This was one which allowed time for confession, absolution, and settling of most earthly affairs. Notably, Hugh's account omits references to unpleasant physical symptoms, which some historians interpret as an omission designed to preserve the monarch's dignity. However, it also raises the intriguing possibility that Henry may not have experienced the intense abdominal pain one would expect from food poisoning. Modern researchers have proposed several alternative explanations for Henry's death. While lamprey poisoning exists as a documented phenomenon, typically caused by improper preparation that fails to remove the fish's mucus covering, it rarely proves fatal. Victims usually experience nausea, vomiting, and weakness, but the condition generally resolves within several days. There are no recorded cases of death from lamprey poisoning in modern medical literature, making it an unlikely culprit. Some medical historians have suggested that Henry may have suffered from a sporadic central nervous system infection of listeria. This is a bacterium commonly found in contaminated food, and this correlates well with the king's recorded symptom onset. Others have proposed various abdominal pathologies, including gastric obstruction, though these conditions typically produce more pronounced gastrointestinal symptoms. Medieval accounts simply don't provide enough clinical detail for a definitive retrospective diagnosis. The timing of Henry's death raises uncomfortable questions about potential foul play. In late 1135, England stood on the verge of a succession crisis. Although Henry had forced his barons to swear multiple oaths supporting his daughter Matilda as his heir, significant opposition to a female ruler existed among the Norman nobility. Relations between Henry and Matilda had soured considerably in the months before his death. She and her husband Geoffrey of Anjou had been actively supporting rebels in southern Normandy against the royal army. The king had angrily refused their demands that he hand over Norman castles to Matilda while he still lived. Several other individuals stood to benefit from Henry's sudden death. Chief among the suspicious figures is Hugh Bigod, the king's royal steward. Immediately after Henry's death, Hugh rushed across the English Channel and presented himself before the Archbishop of Canterbury. There, he swore that Henry had changed his mind on his deathbed and released the barons from their oath to Matilda. This testimony proved pivotal in persuading the hesitant archbishop to crown Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, as king on December 22, 1135. Remarkably, Stephen was crowned before Henry had even been buried, raising further suspicions. Modern historians generally regard Hugh's testimony as dubious, as he was a cunning politician who served 4 different kings and was known primarily for pursuing his own interests. The aftermath of Henry's death provides some of the most macabre details of this story. His corpse was taken to Rouen, where it was embalmed for transport to England. His heart and entrails were removed and buried at the priory of Notre-Dame-du-Pré, while the brain and eyes were extracted. Despite these measures, the body was already beginning to decompose, and the man tasked with removing Henry's brain is said to have died from the overwhelming stench. The chronicler Henry of Huntingdon described in graphic detail the powerful, pervasive odor and the fearful black fluid that leaked from the king's improperly preserved remains. Henry's body was sewn into the hide of a bull and filled with salt in an attempt to preserve it for the journey. Stormy weather in the English Channel delayed the crossing by 4 weeks, during which time black fluid continued to seep through the ox hides. Finally, at Christmas, favorable winds allowed the ship to set sail with whatever remained of his earthly vessel. On January 3rd, 1136, the king was eventually buried before the high altar at Reading Abbey, the monastery he had founded 14 years earlier. Understanding why Henry's death triggered such chaos requires looking back to November 25th, 1120, exactly 15 years before the king's final hunt. On that night, the white ship set sail from Barfleur, carrying approximately 300 passengers, including William Adelin, Henry's only legitimate son and heir. The passengers and crew had been drinking heavily, and when the overconfident captain attempted to overtake the king's ship, the vessel struck a submerged rock and sank. Nearly everyone aboard drowned, including William, 2 of Henry's illegitimate children, and much of the young English nobility. Only one lone butcher from Rouen survived to tell the harrowing tale. It's said that Henry never smiled again after learning of his son's death. He remarried the following year, hoping desperately to produce another male heir, but the marriage remained childless. With no legitimate sons, Henry took the unprecedented step of declaring his daughter Matilda as his heir. The Norman barons reluctantly swore to accept her, but their oaths would prove worthless when the moment of succession arrived. The mysterious death of King Henry ultimately set in motion nearly 2 decades of conflict known as the Anarchy. During this period, England was torn apart by the conflict between Stephen and Matilda. Whether Henry died from a bacterial infection, food poisoning, natural causes, or something more sinister, we will likely never know for certain. The sources are too limited, the symptoms too vaguely described, and the political circumstances too convenient for any one explanation to satisfy completely. What remains clear is that on that December night in 1135, medieval England lost more than just a king. It lost the stability that Henry had spent 35 years building, and the carefully laid succession plans that were meant to secure his dynasty's future. The Surfeit of Lampreys may make for a colorful story, one that medieval chroniclers clearly enjoyed telling, but the real tragedy lies in what came after. A kingdom thrown into chaos, a people subjected to years of warfare, and a succession crisis that would only be resolved when Matilda's son finally took the throne as Henry II in 1154. It's a drunken feast on the mudflats of Greenwich in April of the year 1012. The air reeks of mead and wood smoke. Viking warriors, their blood still hot from months of pillaging the English countryside, have gathered to demand ransom for their most valuable prisoner. The man is Alfred, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The old man refuses to let his people bankrupt themselves to save him. He stands defiant, quoting scripture. Then the mood turns. Someone hurls an ox bone, then another. The missiles multiply into a storm of animal skulls, stones, and scraps from the feast. When the frenzy ends, the archbishop lies dead in the mud, his skull caved in by a thrown axe. Standing apart from the carnage, unable to stop his own men, is the commander of this army, a giant of a man named Thorkell the Tall. According to the chroniclers, he offered everything he owned except his ship to spare the holy man's life. His warriors ignored him. That night, something broke inside the most dangerous Viking warlord in Europe. Within months, he would defect to the English king he had spent 3 years trying to destroy. Thorkell the Tall was born sometime in the 960s, and he came from a family steeped in the warrior traditions of Scandinavia. His brother Sigvaldi served as chieftain of the Jomsvikings, a semi-legendary brotherhood of elite mercenaries based at the fortress of Jomsborg on the Baltic coast. If sources are to be believed, the Jomsvikings were the special forces of the Viking world, bound by strict codes that forbade them from fleeing in battle or showing fear. Through his incredible courage in battle and adherence to a strict code of honor, he eventually rose to the position of chief commander of this elite crew. By 1009, Thorkell had assembled one of the largest Viking armies ever to descend upon England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that his fleet arrived with a terrifying host that proceeded to ravage Kent, Sussex, Hampshire, and Berkshire. The English paid tribute after tribute, thousands of pounds of silver flowing into Viking coffers, but Thorkell kept coming back for more. In September of 1011, his forces besieged Canterbury itself, the spiritual heart of Christian England. The city fell through treachery when an archdeacon named Elfmer, whom the chroniclers describe as a man whose life the archbishop had once saved, opened the gates to the enemy. Alfred was dragged from the altar of his own cathedral and thrown into chains. The archbishop's slaying at Greenwich in April 1012 proved to be a turning point that historians still struggle to fully explain. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states plainly that Thorkell attempted to prevent the slaying, offering his own wealth to ransom the holy man. It remains unclear why a pagan warlord would care about the life of a Christian priest he could easily have ransomed for a fortune. The chroniclers don't give us his reasons, but Thorkell's subsequent actions speak loudly. That same year, he crossed over to King Ethelred with 45 ships and entered English service. The man who had terrorized England for 3 years became its defender overnight. During this period, he also converted to Christianity, as was the style amongst Vikings at the time. This defection reveals something essential about Thorkell's character. He wasn't driven by ideology or loyalty to any crown or mercenary band. He was a professional, a man who sold his sword to whoever offered the best terms, and then honored that bargain absolutely, acting within his own code. When his own men violated the implicit rules of their profession by cutting down a valuable hostage in a drunken rage, Thorkell recognized that he could no longer command them. Some historians speculate that he had essentially lost face by being unable to bring his men to heel. For the next year, he served Ethelred faithfully, helping to defend London against his former Norse allies. The political landscape shifted again in 1013, when Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, launched his own invasion of England. Sweyn died suddenly in February 1014, and his son Canute was initially driven out by the returning English king. But Canute came back in 1015 with a massive army, and this time there would be no reprieve. By 1016, Ethelred was dead. His son Edmund Ironside had fought Canute to a standstill, and the two young kings agreed to divide England between them. When Edmund died under mysterious circumstances just weeks later, Canute became sole ruler of England. Thorkell, ever the pragmatist, had already switched his allegiance once more. Canute rewarded Thorkell handsomely. He was made Earl of East Anglia, one of the most powerful positions in the kingdom. He witnessed royal charters and stood at the king's right hand during public ceremonies. For 5 years, Thorkell was arguably the second most powerful man in England, a living symbol of the Danish conquest. But something went wrong. In 1021, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records a single devastating line: Canute outlawed Thorkell. No reason is given. No explanation appears in any surviving source. The greatest Viking warrior in a generation, the man who had commanded armies that brought kingdoms to their knees, was suddenly cast out of England like a common criminal. Historians have speculated about the cause of this rupture. Some suggest that Thorkell was suspected of plotting against Canute, perhaps harboring ambitions to seize power for himself. Others propose that Canute, having consolidated his rule, no longer needed such a dangerous subordinate, and manufactured an excuse to remove him. A third possibility is that Thorkell's past made him a liability. His defection from the Danish cause in 1012 may have left lingering resentment among Canute's followers, men who remembered that Thorkell had once fought against them. What happened next only deepens the mystery. In 1023, Canute traveled to Denmark and reconciled with Thorkell. The two men exchanged hostages as a guarantee of good faith. Thorkell sent his son to be raised in Canute's household, while Canute left one of his own sons in Thorkell's care. More remarkably, Canute appointed Thorkell as regent of Denmark and guardian of the young prince Harthacnut, an extraordinary gesture of trust. The man outlawed as a traitor 2 years earlier was now entrusted with governing a kingdom and raising the heir to the various crowns of the great conqueror. And then Thorkell the Tall vanished. After 1023, he disappears completely from the historical record. No chronicle mentions his death. No saga describes his final battle. No church claims to hold his bones. For a man of his stature, this silence is extraordinary. When great lords died in the 11th century, someone usually noticed. Their deaths were recorded in annals, commemorated in poetry, or disputed by their heirs. Thorkell simply ceases to exist as far as the written sources are concerned. The theories about his fate range from the mundane to the sinister. He may have died of natural causes, succumbing to disease or old age in Denmark sometime in the 1020s. He would have been in his 50s or 60s by then, fairly old by medieval standards for a man who had spent his life in combat. A darker possibility is that Canute had him permanently silenced, and the reconciliation of 1023 may have been a trap. It was perhaps a way of luring a dangerous rival into a position where he could be eliminated without witnesses. By placing Thorkell in Denmark and keeping his son as a hostage in England, Canute ensured that the old warrior was isolated from potential supporters. However, given that this was an equal exchange of hostages, many historians find this an unlikely scenario. There's also the possibility that Thorkell simply faded into obscurity. The Viking Age was ending. The great raids were giving way to settled kingdoms and Christian conversion. A man whose entire identity was built on raiding may have found himself adrift in a world that no longer had a place for him. Perhaps he died forgotten, tending to the son of the king who had previously betrayed him, all while imagining battles of the past. All we can say for certain is that Thorkell the Tall entered history as a destroyer of kingdoms and a terror of the sea, and exited it as a ghost. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to hit that share button and send this video to your friends and family who enjoy historical content. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. In the annals of medieval history, very few figures capture the imagination quite like Roland the Farter. This 12th century Englishman held what might be the most peculiar job in history: professional flatulist to King Henry II. While the very notion sounds absurd to modern ears, Roland's story offers a fascinating window into medieval entertainment and humanity's timeless appreciation for lowbrow humor. Roland served at the court of Henry II, who ruled England, Wales, and substantial portions of northern and western France from 1154 until his death in 1189. What makes Roland's story particularly remarkable isn't just his unusual talent, it's the extraordinary compensation he received for it. The Liber Feodorum, or Book of Fees, a 13th century English administrative document that recorded feudal landholdings, contains an entry detailing Roland's arrangement. Roland was granted Hemmingstone Manor in Suffolk along with 30 acres of land, a substantial reward that placed him far above the average medieval commoner. Some scholarly estimates suggest he may have received as much as 100 acres total, making his holdings comparable to a minor knight. Roland's entry stands out in the Book of Fees precisely because his service was neither martial nor bureaucratic, but rather purely comedic. Roland's feudal obligation was both delightfully specific and legally binding. According to the Book of Fees, he was required to perform annually on Christmas Day before the assembled royal court. The Latin text describes his duty as performing a jump, a whistle, and a fart, all executed simultaneously. This singular annual performance was apparently entertaining enough to justify considerable real estate holdings. Roland's profession, while unusual, wasn't entirely without precedent or parallel, and the story illuminates broader truths about medieval court culture. Jesters served multiple functions beyond simple amusement, and they weren't only used to lift spirits and bring merriment. They were often far more intelligent than their fool image suggests, using humor to offer genuine counsel and critique that would have been dangerous coming from anyone else. Powerful counselors who wished to offer truly unpopular advice would sometimes choose to filter it through the lens of the jester and gauge the monarch's reaction. This could lead to a frank conversation that the idea raised in jest may be good policy after all. But perhaps most interestingly, Roland's handsome compensation for a single annual performance reminds us that medieval society understood the value of laughter. His entry in the Book of Fees, surrounded by knights and nobles, stands as permanent testimony to the power of a well-timed fart joke. 20 years after the Norman conquest transformed England forever, William the Conqueror commissioned one of the most impressive undertakings in medieval European history. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, stands as a remarkable achievement of governance that continues to captivate historians and genealogists nearly a millennium later. This comprehensive survey documented virtually everything of value across the entire realm, creating an unprecedented snapshot of English society. The story of the Domesday Book begins at Christmas 1085, when William gathered his council at Gloucester to discuss the state of his kingdom. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the king sought detailed knowledge about his realm's resources and who controlled them. The timing wasn't coincidental. England faced potential invasion from Denmark and Norway, and William needed to understand exactly what resources he could call upon. The threat was genuine and pressing, forcing the aging conqueror to take stock of his domain with unprecedented thoroughness. The survey served multiple practical purposes that historians continue to debate even today. Most obviously, it functioned as a taxation tool, enabling the Crown to assess the national land tax, known as the Geld, with greater accuracy and fairness. However, the document also helped resolve disputes over land ownership that had proliferated since the conquest. Norman followers had a tendency to evade the tax obligations of their English predecessors, and William needed a definitive record to hold them accountable. The execution of this massive undertaking demonstrated remarkable administrative sophistication. William divided England into 7 circuits, each containing a cluster of counties, and dispatched teams of royal commissioners to conduct local inquests. These panels typically included 3 to 5 officials, often high-ranking clergy, Norman barons, and sheriffs who held authority to summon local assemblies. The survey was carried out against great popular resentment, suggesting that the English population understood the implications of such thorough documentation of their resources. The commissioners followed a remarkably systematic methodology for the time. They convened sworn inquests at county courts, putting standardized questions to juries comprising local men who could provide accurate information. These juries included a mix of barons and villagers, ensuring that details came from those who truly knew the land. The questions were remarkably comprehensive, covering who held each property, how many people lived there, what resources existed, and crucially, what the land was worth. For each property, questions were asked 3 times to capture changes over different periods. Specifically, they were interested in King Edward the Confessor's reign before 1066, the time land was granted by William, and at the survey date in 1086. The information flowed from these detailed local inquests to Winchester, where scribes translated the returns from French and English into Latin. The entire project was completed with astonishing speed, taking less than a year to survey over 13,000 settlements across England and parts of Wales. The Domesday Book actually comprises 2 distinct volumes with different characteristics. Great Domesday contains the final summarized record for most counties surveyed, while Little Domesday covers Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk in considerably more detail. The latter volume, for reasons unknown, was never condensed and added to the larger work. The contents provide an extraordinary window into medieval life. The survey recorded information about manors, including the amount of arable land, meadows, woodlands, fisheries, mills, and livestock. It documented different classes of inhabitants, aiming to capture everyone who was under the authority of the Crown, at least broadly. The Domesday Book provides stark evidence of the revolution that followed the Norman conquest. Perhaps most dramatically, it shows that land originally owned by approximately 2,000 Saxon landholders had passed to roughly 200 Norman barons by 1086. William himself took about 20% of the territory, with the remaining 80% distributed to his tenants-in-chief. The old Anglo-Saxon landed aristocracy had been almost entirely swept aside, replaced by a foreign elite who owed their positions entirely to the conqueror's favor. Only 2 Anglo-Saxons who held land during Edward the Confessor's reign managed to retain their estates. The survey reveals that around 90% of the population lived in the countryside, and approximately 75% were serfs who worked the land for their Norman lords. The total population recorded adds to roughly 1.5 to 2 million people. This discrepancy is because the survey counted heads of households rather than individuals. The name Domesday, which came into use during the 12th century, carries weighty connotations. Richard Fitzneal, treasurer under King Henry II, explained that the English called it the Book of Judgment. This was because just as no verdict of the final divine judgment could be evaded, so the rulings of this book couldn't be denied or set aside without penalty. The word doom in Old English meant law or judgment, without the modern associations of catastrophe. This sense of absolute finality and authority permeated the document's reputation from its earliest years, making it both feared and respected throughout the medieval period. For centuries after its creation, the Domesday Book served as an active administrative tool. Officials consulted it regularly to settle land disputes and verify tax assessments. The document was first printed in full in 1783, and in 2011 the Open Domesday website made the manuscript accessible online to anyone interested in exploring this medieval treasure. Modern historians consider the Domesday Book invaluable for understanding medieval England. Economic historians have used its detailed figures to estimate agricultural productivity, land values, and resource distribution across different regions. The survey also enables researchers to recreate aspects of the medieval economy that would otherwise remain entirely unknown. No survey approaching the scope and extent of the Domesday Book was attempted again until an 1873 attempt, sometimes called the Modern Domesday. This gap of nearly 8 centuries demonstrates just how exceptional William's achievement was. The bureaucratic machinery required to compile such comprehensive information simply didn't exist elsewhere in medieval Europe. Picture a young king in the autumn of 1016, his body bearing the scars of 5 battles fought in a single year. Edmund, whom his warriors have named Ironside for his relentless courage, sits across from his enemy on a small island in the River Severn near the village of Deerhurst. Facing him is Canute, the Danish prince who has spent the year trying to conquer his kingdom. The two men are negotiating the future of England. Behind them lie fields littered with the dead from Asandun, where the English army was shattered just weeks ago. The terms they agree upon are simple. Edmund will keep Wessex in the south, Canute will rule Mercia and the north, and whoever outlives the other will inherit everything. Edmund is 26 years old and in the prime of his life. 6 weeks later, he is dead, and Canute becomes sole ruler of England. The circumstances of that death have haunted chroniclers and modern historians ever since. Edmund Ironside was born around 990, the son of King Ethelred the Unready and his first wife Elfgifu of York. He grew up watching his father's kingdom bleed silver to buy off Viking raiders, payment after payment of Danegeld flowing into Scandinavian coffers while the countryside burned. By the time Edmund reached manhood, he had developed a very different approach to the Danish problem. Where Ethelred negotiated, Edmund wanted to fight. This difference created a rift between father and son that would define the final years of Ethelred's reign. The crisis came to a head in 1015. Canute, son of the fearsome Sweyn Forkbeard, who had briefly conquered England the year before, set his sights to England. He returned with a massive invasion fleet to claim what he considered his rightful inheritance, stolen from him by the Anglo-Saxons. Edmund responded by raising an army in the Danelaw, the heavily Scandinavian region of eastern England, where he had cultivated alliances independent of Ethelred. His father disapproved of this independent action, but Edmund pressed forward regardless. When Ethelred died on April 23, 1016, the English nobility faced a choice between submitting to Canute or rallying behind the young prince who had already proven himself willing to fight. As the name Ironside might indicate, Edmund was a true leader of men, and despite his youth, he had little trouble winning over both nobles and common folk alike. What followed was one of the most brutal years in English history. Edmund was elected king in London, while Canute received the submission of much of the rest of the country. Whereas Edmund won his people over to his cause, Canute, one of the greatest conquerors in history, used much more direct forms of persuasion. Rather than accept a divided realm, Edmund took the offensive, clashing with Canute throughout the country. He relieved London from a Danish siege, crossed the Thames at Brentford in a daring assault, and defeated Canute at Otford in Kent. The chronicles record that Edmund seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying troops, leading charges, refusing to accept that his cause was lost. The tide turned at Asandun on October 18, 1016. The two armies met somewhere in Essex, though the exact location remains disputed. Edmund had assembled a formidable force, but his coalition included men of doubtful loyalty. Edric Strona, for instance, had already switched sides multiple times during the conflict, betraying first Edmund to Canute, and then Canute back to Edmund. At the critical moment of the battle, Edric fled the field with his massive contingent of troops, and the English line collapsed. Numerous high nobles were slain rather than taken hostage, and while Edmund escaped the meat grinder, his capacity to resist was broken. The meeting at Deerhurst followed shortly after. The sources disagree on the details. Some accounts describe a single combat between the two kings on an island in the Severn, ending when Canute proposed that they stop fighting and divide the kingdom instead. Other versions present a more prosaic negotiation between exhausted armies. Whatever the specifics, the result was the Treaty of Alney, which split England between them. Edmund retained his ancestral kingdom of Wessex, and Canute took everything north of the Thames. The arrangement also included a survivor clause. Whichever king outlived the other would inherit his territories. This provision transformed every day of Edmund's continued existence into a threat to Canute's ambitions. Both men were healthy and in their mid-20s, so this arrangement could have easily lasted 30 or 40 years, but this wasn't to be the case. On November 30th, 1016, Edmund Ironside died. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually so detailed in its accounts of royal deaths, offers nothing about the cause. It simply records that the king passed away and was buried at Glastonbury Abbey beside his grandfather Edgar. A young warrior king who had survived 5 major battles died of unstated causes barely 6 weeks after signing a treaty that made his death enormously profitable for his rival. The chroniclers of the time either didn't know what happened or simply chose not to say, given that this death made Canute the King of England. Later writers were less restrained. Henry of Huntingdon, writing in the 12th century, preserves a gruesome tradition. According to his account, Edmund was slain while using the toilet. A son of the traitor Edric Strona had concealed himself in the cesspit beneath the royal latrine. When Edmund sat down to relieve himself, the assassin struck upward with a sharp weapon, running the king through from below. Other versions specify a crossbow, with one Anglo-Norman chronicler saying that it was a crossbow fired from inside the cesspit itself. This tradition raises obvious problems of plausibility given that it's both disgusting and cinematic. Yet the story persisted for centuries, and historians have debated whether it contains a kernel of truth wrapped in legendary embellishment. Perhaps Edmund was attacked in or near a royal privy, and the details grew more lurid with each retelling. After all, chroniclers like to add additional details, spun out of whole cloth, to improve the narrative payoffs of their tales. Perhaps the entire account is a later invention designed to smear the reputation of Edric Strona, already remembered as one of the worst traitors in English history. Naturally, the question of Canute's involvement remains central to the mystery. He certainly had motive. The treaty guaranteed him nothing unless Edmund died, and the young English king might have lived for decades and produced heirs who would contest Danish rule indefinitely. Canute also had means, in the form of Edric and his followers, who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit treachery. Most suggestively, Canute had Edric executed just over a year later, on Christmas Day 1017. Henry of Huntingdon provides a dramatic account of this event. When Edric reminded Canute of the services he had rendered, Canute replied that a man who had betrayed his own lord deserved death. The sources don't specify what exact services those are, though some have interpreted this to mean the disposal of his arch-nemesis. Regardless of the context, Canute ordered Edric beheaded, and his body thrown over the walls of London. Other sources claim Canute promised to, quote, raise Edric higher than any other noble in England, prior to finishing him off. Being a man of his word, Canute then had his head placed on a spike atop the highest tower in the city. This execution proves nothing about Edmund's death, but it suggests that Canute wanted to distance himself from whatever Edric had done. Edric was clearly a liability, and a clean break with the man who knew too much would be standard practice for a king consolidating his power. Alternatively, Canute may have genuinely been outraged by Edric's serial betrayals and simply seized an opportunity to eliminate a dangerous and untrustworthy subject. The sources are too sparse to determine which interpretation is correct, and both may have been a factor. Some modern historians prefer a mundane explanation for the death of the great young warrior king. Edmund had fought constantly for an entire year. He had led cavalry charges, besieged cities, and marched armies across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Battle wounds, even minor ones, frequently proved fatal in an era without antibiotics. Exhaustion and illness could have claimed a man who had pushed his body to the breaking point. The timing of his death, so convenient for Canute, might be nothing more than coincidence, a happy accident for the all-powerful Dane. After all, the sources do mention that he had been crisscrossing the country to personally lead troops at as many battles as humanly possible. Edmund Ironside is presented in the sources as a young man who fought without fatigue, and there's a very real possibility that his body simply gave out. Yet the aftermath of Edmund's death speaks to a deeper pattern of what I'll call convenience for the Great Dane. Ironside's two infant sons, Edward and Edmund, posed an obvious threat to Canute's dynasty. Rather than slay them openly, Canute sent them abroad. They passed through Sweden, then Russia, and finally Hungary, where they grew to adulthood in exile. The elder son, Edward the Exile, would eventually return to England in 1057, summoned home by the childless Edward the Confessor. Oddly, he died within days of his arrival, under circumstances equally mysterious. His daughter Margaret became Queen of Scotland, and through her, the blood of Edmund Ironside eventually merged with every royal house in Europe. Edmund Ironside was king for 7 months. In that time, he likely fought harder to save his kingdom than any English ruler before or since. This earned him a nickname that would echo through the centuries and speak of great glories on the battlefield and of what may have been. His death at 26, whether by assassination or illness, removed the last serious obstacle to Danish rule in England. In the end, the man who benefited most from that death went on to become one of the greatest kings of all time, ruling England, Denmark, and Norway. When Alfred the Great died on October 26, 899, he was already a legend in his own time. The king who had saved England from Viking conquest, who had built fortified towns across Wessex, and who had championed learning in an age of darkness. He's known as one of the most monumental figures in Anglo-Saxon history, and surely he deserved a final place befitting that legacy. What actually happened to his remains, however, is one of the most frustrating mysteries in English history. Alfred spent his final years at Winchester, which had become the capital of Wessex. When he passed away, he was initially buried in the Old Minster, the Anglo-Saxon cathedral that stood where Winchester Cathedral now dominates the city skyline. This ancient church had been built for King Cenwalh in the 7th century and served as the spiritual heart of the kingdom. However, Alfred hadn't intended this to be his permanent resting place. Before his death, he had begun planning a new monastery adjacent to the Old Minster, purchasing land to create what would become the New Minster. Alfred didn't live to see his project completed, but his son, Edward the Elder, finished the work. Around 900, the New Minster was consecrated, and Edward had his father's body transferred from the old cathedral to the new church. Alfred's wife Elswith was buried there when she died in 902, and Edward himself would eventually join them. The New Minster thus became a royal mausoleum for the House of Wessex, housing the remains of the dynasty that had united England against the Vikings. For roughly 2 centuries, Alfred lay undisturbed in this sacred space. The New Minster accumulated considerable prestige over the generations. But the Norman conquest of 1066 would set in motion events that would eventually lead to the scattering of Alfred's remains across the centuries. Following the conquest, the Normans embarked on ambitious cathedral building, sweeping away many older Anglo-Saxon churches. Winchester's Old Minster was demolished in 1093 to make way for the new Norman cathedral. The New Minster, squeezed beside this massive construction, became impractical as a monastic site. In 1109, King Henry I ordered the monks to relocate to a new abbey north of the city walls, in a suburb called Hyde Mead. The following year, 1110, the monks filed through Winchester's streets, carrying their most precious possessions. Among these were saints' relics, King Canute's great golden cross, and the coffins containing Alfred, his wife, and son Edward. The bodies were reinterred before the high altar of Hyde Abbey, and there they would remain for over 400 years. Hyde Abbey became a popular pilgrimage destination. The abbey survived the anarchy in 1141, when Winchester was burned during fighting between supporters of King Stephen and Empress Matilda. Though the church suffered damage and was substantially rebuilt, the royal tombs apparently remained intact. The 16th century brought catastrophe for Alfred and his remains. When Henry VIII began his dissolution of the monasteries in 1538, Hyde Abbey was surrendered to the crown by its last abbot, John Salcott. Thomas Wriothesley, the king's commissioner for Hampshire, moved with brutal efficiency. Within a year, virtually no trace of the church remained above ground. The buildings were stripped of anything valuable, and the materials were carted away for reuse elsewhere. The antiquary John Leland visited the site just 4 years later, in 1542, and found only ruins. His account mentions that the tomb of Alfred and Edward had been opened, and that 2 small tablets inscribed with their names had been found inside. This suggests the graves had been disturbed during or shortly after the dissolution, though the fate of the bones at that point remains unclear. For the next 2.5 centuries, the site of Hyde Abbey, where Alfred and his family had been buried, was gradually forgotten. Other parts of the former Abbey precinct were developed, but the eastern end, near the stream, was left largely abandoned, covered with mounds of rubble. The most devastating chapter in this story came in 1788, when the county authorities decided to build a small prison directly over the site of the former Abbey Church. Convicts were put to work digging the foundations for their own jail, and in doing so, they began uncovering graves. A local Catholic priest named John Milner witnessed the destruction and recorded his horror at what he saw. With almost every stroke of the tools, he wrote, "Ancient sepulchres were violated, and bones were thrown about carelessly." The prison warden later described to an antiquarian exactly what had been found. 3 stone coffins had been discovered before the site of the high altar, one of them carved from a single block of stone and encased in lead. The prisoners broke up the coffins, sold the lead, and scattered the bones. The broken remains of the stone coffins were reburied deep in a pit. This account, published in a journal called Archaeologia, expressed outrage that the ashes of England's greatest king had been treated with such contempt. The prison was demolished around 1850, and the site's history began to attract renewed interest. In 1866, an antiquarian named John Mellor excavated the area and claimed to have found Alfred's bones. He identified one skull as the king's by comparing it to an image of Alfred on a contemporary coin. Modern scholars consider Mellor a dubious figure at best, and there's evidence he planted fake artifacts to enhance his discoveries. Nevertheless, he sold the bones to the rector of nearby St. Bartholomew's Church, who reburied them in an unmarked grave in the churchyard. When archaeologists exhumed this grave in 2013, they found the bones of at least 6 individuals. Radiocarbon dating showed these remains dated from roughly 1100 to 1500, far too late to be Alfred or his immediate family. The bones likely belonged to patients from the Abbey's medieval infirmary, but the story doesn't end there. Researchers learned that a community excavation at the Hyde Abbey site in the 1990s had recovered human bones that had never been properly analyzed. Among these remains was a fragment of pelvic bone found near the site of the high altar. Radiocarbon dating placed this bone between 895 and 1017. A bone analysis determined it belonged to an adult male aged between 26 and 45 at death. Since there was no Anglo-Saxon cemetery at Hyde Abbey before the royal reburial in 1110, this bone almost certainly belongs to a member of the royal family. The most likely candidates are Alfred himself or his son, Edward the Elder, though it is possible that this was another lesser-known family member. Whether that fragment of bone truly belonged to Alfred the Great may never be definitively proven, though forensic science may hold the key to the mystery. On a cold February night in 1101, a disgraced bishop lowered himself from a window of the White Tower using nothing more than a rope smuggled inside a wine barrel. This was Ranulph Flambard, one of the most powerful men in Norman England, and he was about to become the first person ever to escape from the Tower of London. His story reads like something out of Game of Thrones, complete with drunken guards, political intrigue, and a waiting ship bound for the continent. But every word of it is true, recorded by contemporary chroniclers who witnessed the chaos that followed. To understand why Flambard's escape mattered so much, we need to understand who he was. Born around 1060 in the Diocese of Bayeux, Ranulph came from humble origins, but possessed an extraordinary talent for administration. However, he had an even greater talent for making himself indispensable to powerful men. His nickname, Flambard, translates roughly to torchbearer, though his enemies preferred to interpret it as incendiary. The medieval chronicler Orderic Vitalis claimed the name was given because Ranulph, despite his low birth, had the audacity to order nobles around as if they were servants. Flambard rose through the ranks of William the Conqueror's administration, likely playing a significant role in compiling the Domesday Book. But his real ascent came under William II, better known to history as William Rufus. As the king's chief financial administrator, Flambard developed novel and deeply unpopular methods for extracting revenue from the kingdom. He kept ecclesiastical positions vacant for years, pocketing their income for the royal treasury instead, while also keeping a tidy portion in his own pockets. At one point, he was simultaneously administering 16 bishoprics and abbeys, which for any Crusader Kings players out there was far over his domain limit. Contemporary writers described him in scathing terms, calling him a plunderer of the rich and destroyer of the poor. Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury even described him to the Pope as a rent collector of the worst possible reputation. Despite his infamy, he was simply too wealthy and well-connected to be touched, at least while William Rufus was alive. Yet Flambard wasn't merely a tax collector with sharp elbows. He supervised the construction of London's first stone bridge and oversaw the building of the Great Hall at Westminster. In 1099, his loyalty was rewarded with the bishopric of Durham, one of the wealthiest positions in the English Church. He had reached the pinnacle of power. But just as he hit his zenith, everything changed on August 2nd, 1100, when William Rufus died from an arrow wound while hunting in the New Forest. Whether this was an accident or something more remains debated by historians to this day. What isn't debated is what happened next. William's younger brother Henry moved with extraordinary speed. He seized the royal treasury at Winchester and had himself crowned at Westminster Abbey within 3 days. He did this before his elder brother Robert could return from the First Crusade to press his own far more legitimate claim to the throne. Henry needed to distance himself from his brother's unpopular reign, and Flambard made a perfect scapegoat. On August 15th, 1100, just 10 days after Henry's coronation, the bishop was arrested on charges of embezzlement and imprisoned in the Tower of London. The message was clear. The new king was repudiating the corrupt practices of the old regime. Henry even issued a coronation charter promising to end the very schemes that Flambard had perfected, a document some historians consider a forerunner to the Magna Carta. The tower itself was barely complete when Flambard became its first recorded prisoner. Begun by William the Conqueror in 1078, the massive stone keep had been designed primarily as a symbol of Norman power and a royal residence, not as a prison. Its walls rose 90 feet into the London sky, built from Kentish ragstone with imported limestone from Caen in Normandy. The irony wasn't lost on contemporaries. Flambard had actually supervised the construction of a wall around the tower during Rufus's reign. Now those same walls held him captive. But Flambard's imprisonment was surprisingly comfortable. As a bishop, he retained his servants who brought his meals from outside. His custodian, William de Mandeville, allowed him considerable freedom of movement within the tower. Most importantly, Flambard was permitted to host banquets for his guards, a privilege that would prove his salvation. Flambard spent 6 months cultivating his captor's trust. He threw lavish suppers, keeping the wine flowing freely. Then, on the night of February 3rd, 1101, he made his move. According to Orderic Vitalis, friends had smuggled a rope to Flambard, hidden inside a barrel of wine. That evening, Flambard hosted another feast for his guards, ensuring they drank heavily. When they finally collapsed into drunken sleep, the bishop acted. What happened next required considerable physical courage for a bishop in his 40s. Flambard tied the rope to something secure within his chamber and lowered himself out a window. The descent from the tower was perilous, roughly 90 feet of sheer wall dropping to the ground below. Some accounts suggest the rope may have been too short, or that Flambard's hands were severely injured during the climb, but he made it down alive. Waiting below were comrades who spirited him to a ship already prepared at the riverside. Aboard that vessel were not only some of the bishop's treasure, but also his elderly mother. Within hours, Flambard was sailing across the English Channel toward Normandy and potential freedom. The consequences of Flambard's escape rippled through the political landscape of Norman England. William de Mandeville, his negligent custodian, was stripped of 1/3 of his lands by a furious Henry. But the greater problem was where Flambard went and what he did when he got there. Robert, the Duke of Normandy and Henry's older brother, welcomed the fugitive bishop with open arms. Flambard immediately began pressing Robert to invade England and claim the crown that many believed was rightfully his. Flambard hoped to provide the strategic vision and energy that Duke Robert lacked. Working tirelessly, Flambard organized transport for an invasion fleet and even managed to bribe some of Henry's own ships into defecting, ensuring the Norman army could land safely. In July 1101, just 5 months after his escape, Flambard accompanied Robert as they landed at Portsmouth with an invading army. England stood on the brink of civil conflict. However, the invasion ultimately fizzled. Robert lacked popular support among the English, and many barons remained loyal to Henry. At the Treaty of Alton in August 1101, Robert renounced his claim to the English throne in exchange for financial compensation. Remarkably, Flambard's story didn't end in exile or with his head on the chopping block, even when Henry claimed the Duchy of Normandy in 1106. The politically astute bishop was among the first to make peace with Henry. He returned to Durham, where he spent his remaining years as a construction administrator. He nearly completed the magnificent Durham Cathedral begun by his predecessor, fortified the city itself, built Norham Castle, and founded religious institutions. Flambard's escape would end up establishing a precedent that would inspire approximately 40 successful escapes from the tower over subsequent centuries. Notably, his exact rope ladder technique would be adopted by other famous escapees. But Flambard was truly the original, the very first man to ever prove that even the imposing Tower of London couldn't possibly hold a truly determined prisoner.